I never thought I'd go through something like this. This trip was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me and my son, Liam, at a cabin I rented to relax during the winter. The house was in a remote area with an incredible view of the snow-covered mountains. The silence was almost absolute, which I thought was perfect for unwinding. The first night went by without any issues. Liam was excited about playing in the snow and fell asleep early after a full day of fun. I went to bed early too, exhausted from the drive. But when I woke up in the middle of the night, I saw something that instantly made my stomach drop. Footprints in the snow right by the living room window. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal or something I just didn't notice earlier. But as I got a closer look through the window, it became clear. Those were human footprints, big and well-defined. They came from the far side of the house, circled around to the window, and disappeared toward the forest. My heart started racing. I knew I wasn't imagining things. I quickly shut the curtains and checked all the locks on the doors and windows, trying to stay calm. Even so, I sat on the couch for hours, straining to hear any noise that might confirm someone was out there. When the morning came, I tried to put the whole thing behind me. I didn't want to scare Liam, of course. He was way too excited about playing in the snow again. I decided to step outside and look around in the daylight, and that's when my false sense of security completely shattered. The footprints weren't just there. There were more of them now. It looked like someone had walked around the house several times before leaving. Some prints were so close to the bedroom window that it seemed like whoever it was had stopped there to watch. I spent the whole day trying to keep it together, but I couldn't shake the paranoia. I started checking the locks every hour as if that would help. I also tried calling someone, anyone, but my phone had no signal. That night, I put Liam to bed in my room. I locked the door from the inside and pushed a dresser against it. I wasn't taking any chances. While he slept peacefully, I sat by the window straining to hear anything unusual. The wind howled outside, and the snow tapped against the glass until, around midnight, I heard it. It was faint but unmistakable. Footsteps on the porch. My heart nearly stopped. I knew exactly what I had heard. I got up slowly, trying not to make any noise, and walked to the nearest window. It was dark, but I could make out some movement near the side of the house. It was a shadow, something or someone moving. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter and shined it outside, but I didn't see anything. Just the footprints in the snow, now leading right up to the porch door. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing, imagining every possible worst-case scenario. Whoever it was, they were way too close. I went back to the bedroom and locked myself in again, my ears straining for any sound. Then I heard it. The doorknob on the front door was being jiggled. Someone was trying to open it. The noise was quiet, like they didn't want to be noticed, but I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my phone, even though there was no signal, and froze in place, barely breathing. Every instinct I had told me to grab Liam and run, but with him asleep, I knew I couldn't risk it. All I could do was wait and hope they'd give up. Minutes felt like hours before the sound finally stopped, and everything went quiet again. I didn't move a muscle, listening for any sign that they might still be outside. My head was spinning, wondering if they were waiting for me to let my guard down. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every little sound, whether it was the wind or the creak of the house, made my heart race. I promised myself that as soon as the sun came up, we'd leave that place immediately. When daylight finally came, I mustered up the courage to leave the bedroom. Liam was still asleep and I didn't want to scare him, so I moved as quietly as I could. When I got to the living room, I froze. The back door that I was sure I had locked was slightly open, with snow piled up on the threshold. Someone had been inside the house while we were locked in the bedroom. My entire body went cold as I looked around for any sign of what they might have done. Everything seemed untouched, but on the floor, right near the door, was a single wet footprint leading into the house. My first instinct was to check on Liam. I rushed back to the bedroom, and thankfully he was still there, sleeping soundly. But I knew I couldn't stay in that house another second. My only priority was getting us out of there as fast as possible. I dressed him quickly while he was still half asleep, grabbed our bags without caring about being organized, and got ready to leave. Every second felt like someone might show up behind me. Before stepping out, I glanced at the living room one last time, and that's when I saw it. A handprint smeared on the window that faced the backyard. It wasn't there the night before. I've never driven so fast in my life, even with the snow-covered roads. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. When I tried explaining what happened to the property owner, she seemed more concerned about whether I had damaged anything in the house than about what I went through. I never got any explanation for the footprints, the jiggling doorknob, or how the back door had been opened. To this day, I have no idea who or what was watching us that night. But one thing's for sure. I've never rented a remote cabin again, and even now, thinking about it makes my chest tighten. I've never been one for winter adventures, but that time I gave in to my friend's insistence. It was supposed to be just a simple hike, nothing too far or dangerous. But you know how things never go as planned, right? The snow started falling heavier halfway through, covering the trails we were using to find our way. At first, we laughed about it, thinking it was just a minor detour. But after realizing we'd been walking in circles and nothing looked familiar anymore, the nervousness started kicking in. The silence in the middle of winter is something no one prepares you for. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of snow under your boots and, occasionally, our anxious voices breaking the stillness. It was almost nightfall when we found the cabin. If I'd come across that place under different circumstances, I would have turned right around. It was small, dark wooden with broken windows, but it looked sturdy enough to keep us safe from the cold. We didn't have many options, so we decided to go in. The door was unlocked, which was strange enough, but nobody said anything about it. Inside, it was more comfortable than we expected. There was an old couch, a few chairs, and a fireplace with wood stacked neatly like someone had just left. But everything was covered in dust. We lit the fireplace and tried to warm up, nervously laughing about our situation. Still, there was something about the air in that place that made me feel uneasy. After a while, we started exploring the cabin. It wasn't big, just 2 rooms, but enough to shelter us. In the bedroom, we found a bed with blankets that looked new. They weren't torn or moldy like you'd expect in an abandoned place. There was also a coat rack with heavy jackets, the kind you wear for extreme cold, and a shelf with canned food that wasn't expired. That should have been comforting, but somehow it made everything feel worse. Who leaves behind things like that? None of us wanted to say it out loud, but you could tell everyone was thinking the same thing. Is this cabin really abandoned? It was past midnight when the noises started. I was almost dozing off on the couch, trying to ignore how uncomfortable I felt, when I heard footsteps in the snow. At first it was faint, like someone walking slowly, trying not to be noticed. I held my breath, hoping it was just my imagination, but then the sound got clearer, closer. I glanced at my friends and saw that some of them had heard it too. Nobody spoke, but the fear in their eyes was obvious. One of the guys, Lucas, went to the window to take a look, but all he could see was darkness and the snow reflecting faint moonlight. Whatever, or whoever, it was out there. They knew how to stay hidden. We tried to convince ourselves it was just animals, maybe wolves or something. But deep down, none of us really believed that. The footsteps were too deliberate, too spaced out, like someone was walking around the cabin on purpose. We locked the door and jammed a chair under the handle, just in case. By this point, nobody was saying much, and you could feel the tension in the air. That's when Pedro, who was sitting near the fireplace, said something that sent chills down my spine. Have you noticed how everything here is way too well preserved? Like, look at this. He pointed to a shelf lined with hunting rifles. They were spotless, no rust, no dust. It didn't make sense. An abandoned cabin with weapons in perfect condition? That uneasiness turned into real fear. Then the sounds outside changed. Instead of footsteps, it sounded like something heavy being dragged through the snow. It was deep, muffled, and you could almost feel it through the wooden walls. The urge to open the door and see what was happening was almost unbearable, but nobody dared to say it out loud. I backed away from the window and sat on the floor with my back to the wall, trying to steady my breathing. It felt like we were being watched, like whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where we were and was waiting for us to make a move. And that's when it hit me. The snow had stopped falling hours ago, but the sounds of dragging and footsteps kept going. The tension was suffocating. Every little noise felt amplified, closer. Then suddenly the dragging sound stopped, and for a moment, everything went silent again. But the quiet only lasted a second before we heard the door creak, like someone was testing the doorknob. Lucas grabbed one of the axes we'd found in the cabin, and I braced myself to run, even though I had no idea where we'd go in that darkness. The sound of the doorknob turning continued, slow and deliberate, until it stopped just as suddenly as it started. We sat frozen, not daring to breathe, waiting for whatever was outside to make its next move. Out of nowhere, there was a loud bang. Something slammed against the side of the cabin. It sounded like a warning, a way to let us know we shouldn't be there. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Lucas crept toward the window to look outside again, but this time he saw something. A shadow. A figure moving quickly through the trees before disappearing into the darkness. That was enough to send us all into a panic. We started whispering about whether we should stay or try to leave, but no one wanted to be the first to step out into the night. The only thing we knew for sure was that whoever or whatever was out there wasn't alone. We decided it was safer to stay put until daylight. None of us could sleep, though. We were too wired, too terrified. The hours dragged on, and every so often we'd hear faint noises coming from the woods. It sounded like branches snapping under heavy steps. No one dared to look outside again. Around 3 in the morning, we heard something new. Voices. They were low, almost whispers, and impossible to understand, but they were definitely human. That confirmed it. We weren't dealing with animals. The voices seemed to come from every direction, like we were surrounded. Then they stopped as suddenly as they'd started, leaving us in a silence that was somehow worse. When the sun finally started to rise, the faint light gave us a bit of courage. We opened the door and stepped outside, our legs shaking as we tried to act braver than we felt. The snow around the cabin was covered in footprints, dozens of them, circling the place like whoever had been out there was watching us all night. But the scariest part was what we found on the side of the cabin, where we'd heard that loud bang, a huge mark on the wooden wall, like something heavy had been dragged away from there. We didn't find anyone, and there was no sign of who or what had been out there. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that they were playing with us, testing us. What would have happened if we'd stepped outside that night? I guess I'll never know, and honestly, I don't want to. I've always been the kind of person who finds peace in solitude, especially out in nature. Climbing mountains during the winter was my way of escaping the chaos of city life. This time, I picked a mountain infamous for its extreme challenges, but the views were supposed to make it worth it. I reached the base camp in the late afternoon, with the icy wind biting my face and snow piling up quickly around me. I set up my tent, sorted my gear, and got everything ready before nightfall. Everything was in place, and despite the cold, I felt energized by the isolation. No one for miles. But that's exactly what made what happened next so much stranger. That first night, things started feeling off. While I tried to sleep, I heard what sounded like footsteps in the distance. At first, I chalked it up to the wind, but the sound was too rhythmic, like someone testing the snow around the area. I ignored it and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent to check my gear and noticed something strange. My stove was sitting a few feet away from where I'd left it. There wasn't any wind strong enough to move it, and I knew for sure I hadn't misplaced it. I tried brushing it off, thinking maybe I was overthinking things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stuck to my routine, trying to keep my mind busy. I made coffee, organized my supplies, and prepared for the climb I had planned for the day. After a few hours of scouting the area, I returned to the camp and found footprints in the snow around my tent. They weren't mine, that much I was certain of. The steps were spaced apart as if someone had been circling the tent slowly, deliberately. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of another person, but the place was as deserted as ever. The wind was starting to erase the tracks, but they looked fresh. The idea that someone was out there with me without making themselves known sent a chill down my spine. That night, the sounds became harder to ignore. It was pitch black outside, and what I heard didn't match the howling of the wind. There were faint scratching noises like something brushing against the fabric of the tent, and then those footsteps again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted out, expecting to catch sight of something, or someone. But there was nothing, just snow and silence. I circled the camp, checking my gear. Everything seemed untouched, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I went back inside the tent, more determined than ever to pack up and leave at first light. It wasn't just the harsh weather anymore. Something about that mountain made me want to get out of there fast. When I woke up, something felt off. The silence was so intense it was almost suffocating, like the usual sounds of wind and snow had just stopped. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, only to find food wrappers scattered in the snow a few meters away from the camp. At first I thought it might have been animals, but there weren't any paw prints, just human-like footprints, the same ones I'd seen the day before. The bag I kept my food in had been ripped open, and a good portion of my supplies was gone. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just in my head. Someone was out here messing with my stuff. My first instinct was to gather whatever I had left and pack up as quickly as possible. I needed to get off that mountain. But when I started looking for my climbing rope, it was gone. I tore through my things, checking every possible spot it could have been. Nothing. Without that rope, the descent would be much riskier, especially with the icy conditions. My heart was pounding as I realized whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. It wasn't random. It felt calculated, like they wanted to trap me up there. I tried to improvise with what I had. I grabbed some tent stakes and a few smaller cords, though I knew they wouldn't be enough for the entire climb down. As I worked, the weather started to shift. A thick fog rolled in out of nowhere, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The wind picked up again, but it wasn't steady. It came in bursts, almost like whispers carrying through the air. I kept looking around, hoping to spot whoever was behind this, but the visibility was too poor. The overwhelming feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Halfway down, things went from bad to worse. I tried to move quickly, but every step felt heavier, like the mountain itself was working against me. Then I saw them. The footprints. They were back, this time right beside mine, as if someone had been walking alongside me the entire time. The thing is, they didn't start from behind me where I had been. They just appeared fresh in the untouched snow. It didn't make sense. Logic told me it was impossible, but nothing about this climb felt logical anymore. Every step I took seemed to be shadowed by 2 or 3 that weren't mine, and the fear started to consume me. My gut told me not to look back, but I couldn't help it. When I turned, there was nothing, just the fog and those same footprints forming in the snow a few meters behind me. It was like something invisible was there, mirroring my every move. The sound of my boots crunching in the snow was joined by a second, lighter crunching sound, almost too faint to notice, but it was there. I forced myself to keep moving, heart racing, my brain scrambling for any kind of explanation. The cold felt sharper, cutting through my layers of clothing like they weren't even there. At one point, it felt like something was closing in on me, but I didn't stop. All I could think about was getting out alive. When I finally reached a flatter part of the trail, I turned around one last time. The footprints were gone, the wind had stopped, and the fog was lifting, leaving behind an eerie, unnatural stillness. It was as if nothing had ever happened. I made it back to the spot where I'd parked my car, and to my relief, it was exactly as I had left it. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. To this day, I have no idea who or what was up there with me. I just know I'll never climb that mountain again. Even now, just thinking about it gives me chills. Whatever it was, it felt like it wanted me to stay, and I'll never understand why. The night it all happened, I was driving through a snowstorm that felt like it would never end. Visibility was nearly zero, and every mile felt like a battle to keep the car steady on the icy road. I knew I couldn't keep going for much longer, so I felt relieved when I saw a sign for a rest area up ahead. The small shelter there had a lit fireplace, clearly meant for emergencies like this. As soon as I stepped inside, the warmth was a welcome relief for my frozen hands. But the comfort didn't last long. There was only one other person in the shelter, a middle-aged man sitting in the corner, bundled up in an old coat that didn't look warm enough for the weather outside. He greeted me with a smile, friendly enough, but something about it felt a little off. At first, he just made casual comments about the storm, but then his questions started to feel invasive. He asked if I was traveling alone, where I was heading, and if anyone knew I was out there. It gave me a weird feeling, like he was sizing me up and not in a good way. Even though I felt uneasy, I tried to act normal. I told him vaguely that I was just passing through and that my family knew where I was, which was true. He chuckled in response, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that puts you at ease. It was more like he knew something I didn't. He kept talking about how dangerous storms like this could be, throwing in stories about drivers who never made it to their destinations. His tone made it feel less like a warning and more like a threat. The air in the shelter felt heavier with each word he spoke. As the night dragged on, I started to notice things that didn't sit right. He never took off his coat, even with the fire blazing, and he didn't have any food or drink with him. While I was fighting to stay awake, he just sat there, unmoving, with his eyes locked on me the entire time. The longer I stayed, the more I felt like I needed to get out of there. Staying overnight suddenly didn't feel safe at all, even with the storm raging outside. I decided to play it cool and told him I needed to grab something from my car. He just nodded, but his eyes followed me all the way to the door. The second I stepped outside, the icy wind hit me like a wall, and I had to push through the snow just to make it to my car. That's when my stomach dropped. All 4 of my tires were slashed, like someone had gone to work on them with a sharp blade. My breath caught in my throat as I looked around and saw footprints in the snow, circling my car and leading back to the shelter. I tried to stay calm and act like I hadn't noticed anything. When I went back inside, he was still sitting there, staring into the fire with that same unsettling smile. I sat down again, forcing myself to think of a plan, but every nerve in my body was screaming at me to leave. He didn't say much after that, but his presence alone was suffocating. There was something wrong with him, something that didn't feel human. I was trapped between the storm outside and whatever he was. Finally, I saw my chance when he turned slightly to adjust something in his coat. Without thinking twice, I bolted for the door. The freezing wind stung my face as I ran into the storm, but I didn't stop. My boots crunched against the snow as I pushed forward, hoping and praying to see another car or some kind of help. The thought of him following me kept my adrenaline pumping, but I was too afraid to look back. Eventually, I heard it. Slow, heavy footsteps crunching through the snow behind me. They weren't fast, but they were deliberate. Like whoever it was knew they didn't need to rush. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out, but I forced myself to keep going. The storm was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and the footsteps kept coming, steady and unrelenting. I didn't dare turn around to see how close he was. After what felt like an eternity, I finally worked up the courage to glance over my shoulder. There was nothing there, just the dark storm and the trail of footprints I had left behind. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. My gut told me that looking back was a mistake, so I focused on moving forward. Each step felt heavier, like the snow was trying to pull me down, and my legs were starting to ache from the cold. My breath came out in sharp, uneven gasps as the wind howled around me. Then it hit me. I wasn't making any progress. The rest area was suddenly visible again through the storm, exactly where it had been before. Somehow, I had been walking in circles, even though I thought I was heading straight toward the road. Panic set in, and I realized how badly I was trapped. My car was useless, the storm was getting worse, and now I was right back where I started, with him still inside that shelter. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing with options that didn't exist. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside, but staying out in the storm seemed just as dangerous. My fingers were numb, my face stung from the cold, and the snow was starting to pile up around my boots. The thought of those slashed tires and his footprints circling my car replayed in my head over and over. He had done that while I was inside, and I had no idea what else he might be capable of. I forced myself to take a step back toward the shelter, thinking maybe I could just sit near the door, out of his sight. But as I got closer, I saw something that froze me in place. His face was pressed against the window, watching me. He wasn't smiling anymore. He just stared, unblinking, like he was waiting for me to make a move. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no getting away from him tonight. I backed away from the window, my legs shaky and unsteady. The snow was coming down harder now, almost blinding me as I tried to figure out what to do. I knew I couldn't just stand there, but every option felt like a dead end. I decided to follow the road, even if it meant freezing out there. The idea of staying anywhere near him was worse than the thought of collapsing in the storm. I turned and started walking again, pushing through the snow with everything I had left. But after a few minutes, something changed. The footsteps I had heard earlier were gone. The storm was loud, sure, but the absence of sound was even more terrifying. I stopped and turned around, half expecting to see him standing there in the distance. There was nothing. No footsteps, no movement, no sign that he'd ever left the shelter. It didn't make sense. My mind raced, trying to piece everything together, but I couldn't. I was too cold, too scared, and too desperate to think straight. When I finally saw headlights in the distance, I felt a surge of relief like I'd never experienced before. A snowplow was clearing the road, moving at a slow but steady pace. I stumbled into its path, waving my arms and shouting for help. The driver stopped and let me climb into the cab, where the heat hit me like a wave. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words were jumbled, and the driver just kept telling me to calm down. I glanced back at the shelter as we drove away, but it was swallowed by the storm. To this day, I don't know who or what that man was. I never found out why he was there, what he wanted, or how he moved so silently through the storm. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before, and I don't think I ever will again. I haven't driven through that stretch of road since, and honestly, I never plan to. Some things are better left behind. If you enjoyed the stories, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support our work, and never miss the next ones. Thank you.